In this episode, we are going to continue our series on safety management systems, and I will break down ISO 45001. We'll talk about the components and some of the requirements of each component so that you can better prepare for ISO 45001 if that's something you choose to pursue for your organization. A great example of a safety management system, ISO 45001, in this episode. So let's get into it.
Welcome to the Safety Pro Podcast, powered by iReportSource, helping you manage safety one episode at a time. With the constant regulatory and workplace culture challenges businesses face, we'll provide you with all the relevant information necessary to achieve a safer, more productive workplace. No management theories, platitudes, or guru speak, just actionable info you can use right away. Now here's your host, the Safety Pro himself, Blaine Hoffman.
Welcome back to another episode of the Safety Pro Podcast. As mentioned, we'll get into ISO 45001. This series of safety management systems, we had to start with, okay, let's define what a safety management system is. Let's sort of talk about the mindset the organization has to adopt, a systems thinking, making that shift from program mindset to a systems approach to managing safety and risk as well. So we kind of covered some foundational items and elements. And now we're going to get into an example of a popular safety management system, and that's ISO 45001. Now, according to ISO, the purpose of a safety management system is to provide a framework for managing safety and health risks and opportunities as well. Of course, this means preventing workplace accidents, injuries, and illnesses by recognizing and eliminating or managing risks by taking preventative and protective measures. The structure of ISO 45001 will tell you everything you need to know about how effective safety management systems are set up. So let's take a look at this safety management system at a high level, and then we'll get into some of the elements there moving forward. So there are 10 areas of focus that are found in ISO 45001, and they're numbered 1 through 10. So I'll just start at number 1, of course. We're talking about the scope is number 1. Number 2, references. And these are the scope of this standard, right? And then the references. They're going to reference, where they got information from. They reference material, how they developed this, and all that good stuff. Number 3 is definitions. And it is what it is. They define terms that are used throughout the ISO 45001. And so that you kind of get an idea of what the heck they're talking about. Then number 4, this is where we actually start getting into some of the requirements and where they start laying out some aspects of an effective safety management system. So number 4 is context of the organization. Number 5, leadership and worker participation. Number 6 is planning. Number 7, support. Number 8, operation. Number 9, performance evaluation. And number 10, improvement. So number 4 through 10, that's where we're going to focus. I'm not going to go through every one of them in great detail, but I want to blow through 4 through 10 and give you an idea of what you're looking at if you want to pursue ISO 45001. Starting with the context of the organization, you first need to understand your organization, your company, its context and its needs and expectations of just the workers, as well as what ISO calls other interested parties like vendors, suppliers, contractors, even customers. The scope is everything around the why the company is in business and how the company makes or provides the products or services that it offers. And if you recall, in the last episode, we talked about this. That is why I wanted to lay that foundation for you. And I got some feedback from people on the first couple of episodes. They're like, yeah, but get into a safety management system. And my thought about it was, I can just jump right into what is this? What is SMS? And here's an example of one, and then leave it at that. It's very important when all of my work with people that were pursuing, whether it was partnering with OSHA, VPP, or ANSI Z10, and now we've got ISO 45001, understanding what was required in the standard, voluntary or otherwise, that wasn't the problem that organizations had, okay? The problem was changing that mindset, switching from, you're not managing a program. You have to adopt a systems approach to managing safety, and systems thinking is required. And then we got to get to when it requires incident investigations, what are they talking about? They're talking about a systems approach to root cause and contributing factors to those root causes. So that's why I got into continuous process improvement and what does root cause analysis, or RCA, or fault analysis, right? RCFA. What does that mean really to us in this industry, and what does it not mean? And I talked about all of that good stuff. And when I mentioned the why and then the how we make what we make, that thinking goes into play here when ISO says you have to understand and map out the context of the organization. So in the case of manufacturing, what machines, processes, etc. are involved? What about chemicals, tools, materials, even raw materials that are needed? How do you get them? Where do you order them from? How do you get them to your facility? Where do you store them? Who unloads them? Who handles them? What trades or special skills are required of workers? What planned or performed work-related activities will be needed? And the same goes for construction as well. Mining, hospitality, retail, food industries. You have to understand the context of the organization, the entire scope. That's going to drive everything else that you do. You'll identify some expectations, right? That could be legal ones, like compliance with laws and regulations. That's going to be driven based on, this context that we talked about. We're also going to decide on other expectations. They're going to be either industry driven or corporate driven, self-imposed, right? Like best practices or compliance with, some corporate guidelines, even voluntary guidelines like ISO or ANSI or VPP, right? Those are going to be some expectations you have to meet. So your safety management system has to also take into account the context of the organization, but also be able to achieve the expectations placed on the organization once you get through the context, when you start to discover, these rules and regs and laws and statutes and ordinances apply, and these are our self-imposed requirements. And so your safety management system has to be able to meet those expectations. So you have to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve that safety management system. This includes the processes needed to do so and the interactions that they have with other areas of the organization. And ISO lays these out, right? So we get into things like leadership, worker participation, planning, support, operation, performance evaluations, improvement of the safety management system, and then, wash, rinse, and repeat, right? So that was number 4, the context of the organization. Now, 5 through 10, that sort of gets into what I was just talking about. Number 5 is leadership and worker participation. This section addresses 2 of the foundational elements of any safety management system, right? The leaders and the workers. This relationship is absolutely critical to the success of everything the business does, right? Including safety. As for leadership, they need to be committed to the safety management system. First and foremost, right out of the gate, ISO 45001 spells this out. Commitment. Now, here are some things needed to achieve this according to the 45001 standard. Leadership must accept overall accountability for the prevention of workplace injuries and illnesses, as well as establishing a safe work environment and work-related activities. Also, they have to ensure that the overall safety and health policy and related goals and objectives are established and compatible with the strategic direction of the company. So here we have to have safety and health aligned with the rest of the business. Leadership must also make sure that they integrate the safety management system elements, the individual elements, into the rest of the business processes. Leaders have to make sure that adequate resources that are needed to establish, implement, and maintain a safety management system are actually provided at all times. This includes qualified personnel to contribute to the safety management system effectiveness, right? Safety pros, CIHs, environmental engineers, whatever, it all goes back to the scope. Once you go through the scope of the organization, context of the organization, then everything kind of falls out of that. Then you'll know what kinds of support you're going to need from, expertise and personnel. Top leadership has to also communicate the importance of effective safety management and compliance with all of the requirements that the company sets forth. That communication is critical. They have to also ensure that safety management system actually achieves its desired outcomes through what has been mentioned already, but also by promoting a continuous process improvement approach. It's actually required. So ISO spells that out. Supporting other management roles so that they may also ensure safety management success is a requirement of leadership as well. So frontline supervisors, leadership has to support them in their role of making sure safety management system success is in place. So, you're going to get into roles and responsibilities later and how we define that, but that's key. Don't skip middle management. And develop and lead a culture that supports the intended outcomes of the safety management system. This means protecting workers from retaliation when reporting hazards, concerns, or suggestions, or just participating in workplace safety activities. Also, by making sure workers are included in the decision-making process when it comes to safety and health. The easiest way to do this, and it's also an ISO 45001 requirement, is establishing a safety and health committee. But remember, they've got to have teeth. It can't just be a paper tiger, right? You can't just say, hey, we've got a safety and health committee, and all they do is have the safety director or manager talk at them once a month about what happened that previous month, and then they go on their merry way. No, they have to actually be a working committee involved in making decisions about improving safety and health and discovering root causes and making recommendations, all that good stuff, okay? So how does your leadership stack up to what ISO says it looks for? So worker participation, I mentioned that, but I'll touch on that again, but it's got to be meaningful. They have to be involved. Now we'll get into the next one, which is the safety and health policy. Again, this is still under leadership and worker participation, but the safety and health policy is key. I wanted to, take time to talk about that one. So when I mentioned that leadership needs to establish a safety and health policy, what are some of the requirements for this policy? What does ISO say that the policy has to do at a minimum? I've got a list. There's 4 that I boiled down for you from ISO 45001. It must include a commitment to provide safe and healthy working conditions for the prevention of work-related injuries and illnesses. All right? It has to address the expected hazards based on the size and scope of the organization. And we talked about that. The policy has to set up a framework for setting safety and health goals and objectives that are specific to the expected hazards or work activities, can be measured, that are achievable and relevant to safety and health program elements, and they're set at least annually. So it's the old SMART approach to goals and objectives, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. It has to include a written commitment to meeting basic legal and other requirements as discussed, eliminating or reducing or managing risks, and continuous process improvement of the management system. Roll that all up into one general statement that leadership signs off on. It says this is what we're committed to. It has to be in writing. So here we see leadership commitment moving from theory to spelling it out on paper, and that written policy has to be communicated and available to all employees. Then we get to roles and responsibilities. I mentioned middle management, but it just doesn't stop at middle management. It's every level of the organization. But in order to carry out all of the business commitments, the company needs to staff appropriately. And as such, every employee has a purpose in the organization which needs to be defined. This includes safety and health, not just what you're going to do, when you come to work every day for us, but safety and health as well. Here's where we need well-written job descriptions and roles and responsibilities for safety and health. The reason this is key is because every worker, regardless of their role, needs to know what's expected of them when they start with the company every day. Okay, this is the first impression they get when they join. These expectations, they've got to be measurable or observable. So we want to avoid these high-level language like must support safety efforts or demonstrate leadership in safety. Okay, what does that mean? We have to define these with actions, spell them out, and communicate them. So I have a download for you that you can see what I mean, but this is a critical piece. I routinely see companies struggle with middle managers not being quote unquote committed, yet when they're hired, none of this was covered with them. There was no expectation defined for them. And when you tell a dozen or so supervisors they need to, again, quote, support safety, well, guess what? They're going to do their version of all of them. And it's going to likely, be their interpretation of it. And no two will do it the same way. And you're going to get that variance in, people doing this thing because I think it shows support for safety. And we don't even need you to do that thing. That's not what we need. So, you've got to define this, clearly define this, and you do that with roles and responsibilities. So you see now how this all kind of works together. This is what we mean when we say it requires a systems approach. So now HR is involved, and you've got hiring. You want to interview the right person with the right mindset. You want to look at their background and experience. And yeah, you've run a small production crew, but have you had any experience with safety, root cause analysis, incident investigation? I did a whole episode on how to interview for a safety mindset. So go back and check that one out. But, again, a systems approach. We're talking about a whole system here that needs to pitch in, needs to work together to achieve this. So here are some examples. One, serving on a safety committee. It should be a requirement, or could be a requirement of a job. Or you could use this as an example of how, when we say, do you support or you work to support safety and health, serving on a safety committee. Another one, volunteering as a first aid provider, participating in area inspections or program audits, establishing an incentive program, serving on a special team like ergo or wellness, participating in training programs, managing a suggestion program, participating in continuous process improvement activities, and conducting incident investigation. Look, the list goes on, but I can see these things and go, okay, that person routinely does these things here. They're supporting our safety process. So if supervisors are required to participate and support safety, we need to spell that out. So if you tell employees that you are allowed to participate in a safety committee and you've chosen your employees and you meet once a month, and the supervisor is giving them grief for being off of their machine or doesn't really give them a whole lot of time to get away to come to the meeting, that's not supporting safety. But if all you do is say must support safety and you don't define it for them, and they have safety talks before each shift change meeting and they go, no, I'm supporting safety. I'm talking safety at every shift change meeting before everybody starts. Get out of that conversation quickly by just spelling this out, okay? They have to provide adequate time and resources for their people to participate in safety. And if the company says we have a safety committee made up of a good cross-section of the organization, you have to give them the time they need to fulfill that obligation. All right, planning. I mentioned planning as one of the elements as well. Look, once you have the scope of the organization, all interested parties, and you begin to size up the safety management system, you have to plan for all of these aspects, right? This means accounting for all of the hazards, risks, opportunities, and even legal requirements to ensure the SMS is comprehensive and it's going to achieve its intended goals. This has to be documented, by the way. ISO 45001 requires this planning, the process to be documented, including the process and actions needed to address identified risks and opportunities. So let's get into what activities support planning for SMS success according to ISO 45001. Well, the most obvious one safety pros will be familiar with is hazard identification. You have to create and maintain a process for hazard identification. This has to be proactive and continuous. Some areas that you're going to need to focus on could include any of the following: how the business plans and organizes work. Things like workload, shifts, and discrimination, harassment policies, or leadership practices that drive culture. All of those have to be considered. Another one is assessing routine and non-routine work. Now, this could be work involving facilities, equipment, tools, processes, product services that are offered, assembly operations, construction, disposal. I mean, everything. You have to assess routine and non-routine work. Remember, written assessment. A review of past incidents needs to be a big part of the hazard identification as well. This not only includes incidents inside the organization, but also outside the organization. Like, think about this. What about local or regional disasters or events stemming from nearby companies or emergencies, right? What is our response to that? Do we plan for that? Have we assessed that? You're going to need to include an assessment of personnel and outside persons, right? Those that have access to the company and the property, and also those in the vicinity, like municipal workers, utilities, even neighbors in the neighborhood, right? That could impact the business and also be impacted by operations. You have to do an assessment of personnel inside and outside. Another issue to consider for hazard identification could be workstation design, layout, operating procedures, and support for those activities. Another aspect of hazard identification is whether or not there are effective controls in place, or if controls are needed as a result of the hazard assessment that you identified, oh, we don't have controls in place for this or that. You will need to use a recognized and accepted approach to assessing and determining the level of risk so that appropriate controls can be, chosen. A hierarchy of controls is an example, but the hierarchy of controls should be driven by like a risk assessment matrix, or risk assessment code matrix, or a RAC matrix, or rack and stack is what we called it. What's the frequency of the task, which drives the exposure? And then if something were to happen, what would be the severity? And then that would drive the hierarchy of control. Infrequent and low hazards, we can use administrative controls, signs, warnings, postings, training, or things like that. I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying, that's how this works, this sliding scale. But something that's a little more hazardous, more severe, whether it's frequent or infrequent, should drive guarding, supplementing with something less hazardous, isolating that hazard, somehow controlling access, something like that. So it should be a little higher on the hierarchy of control scale. That's how that works. Those two, the hierarchy of controls and the risk assessment code matrix, they work together. Start with assessing the risk, and that will drive the appropriate management control. You also want to have a process in place to constantly assess work. This includes work areas, processes, for improvements and improvements to the safety management system, of course, as well. Things like looking at software solutions to help manage aspects of the safety system, new equipment to better mitigate or manage specific hazards, continuous improvement, right? That's the goal here. So this never stops. You're always supposed to be assessing every, it should be at least annually, but assessing the tools and products and systems that you use to achieve this safety and health in your organization. You're always supposed to be assessing those. So you have to have a process in place to do this. Finally, you need to have access to the latest regulatory information, whether that be federal, state, or local. This includes professionals that specialize in this area, like safety pros. The company has to be able to demonstrate that it took these legal aspects into consideration when designing work and processes and things like that. This too can be included in a documented hazard assessment process. All of this gives us a clear understanding of what has been identified, planned, and in place, as well as what is still needed. The other key thing you're going to need to document is when you identify a risk or a hazard to which you do not have a permanent solution yet, you have to have interim controls in place, and you have to document those as well. That brings us to the next little section here that ISO calls out, which is safety and health objectives. I mentioned SMART goals and objectives, so don't forget that piece. But look, the business needs to create safety and health goals and objectives. These will need to be consistent with the established safety and health policies. And again, be smart. It's got to be measurable. You got to communicate them. They have to be updated and monitored as needed. So some things that ISO says you have to document related to your safety and health objectives. 1, what needs to be done? 2, what resources will be needed? 3, who will be responsible for what parts? 4, establish a realistic time frame. 5, how will you ensure the results achieve the objectives? And 6, how will results be scaled across the business? So these are all things that you can document that will support, yes, we identify and establish and work to achieve our safety and health goals and objectives. They're relevant to our business and they're ongoing, and they drive what we do day in and day out here at this organization. I mentioned support for safety. I mentioned the need to provide safety pros and others trained and qualified to carry out aspects of the safety management system, but this is just about one way leadership can, the company, the organization, can show support for safety. Beyond these individuals, the company has to be able to demonstrate how it is ensuring employees are competent to comply with and act on behalf of the safety management system as well. This competence can be documented in different ways, everything from specific training and qualifications to establishing a comprehensive on-the-job training program with evaluations and even refresher requirements. So at a minimum, workers must be aware of the safety management system policies, objectives, and how their participation leads to its success. You need to also ensure that they understand the consequences of not meeting safety management system requirements. So when you say, I expect you to participate in incident investigations, you have to also demonstrate, document how you supported them in that expectation. Did you provide root cause analysis training, HOP training, lean training, whatever you decide to do to support them in that role? That is something you can point to. The company, the organization, and leadership can point to say, we support safety in our organization. We don't just say it. We just don't say we have a safety policy and we tell everybody they have to be safe. We actually support them in achieving those goals, and that's key. Another part of increasing awareness of safety includes communicating the results of learnings from incident investigations. That includes, by the way, newly discovered risks or hazards and how the company is managing them. And of course, a clearly communicated Stopwork policy. That has to be a part of any safety and health policy. But ISO calls that out specifically. A Stopwork policy has to be implemented. Employees need to be aware of what to do when faced with a hazard or a risk that was not previously identified and managed. Okay? This is key. You have to account for this and give employees the opportunity to stop and get somebody's attention before work proceeds when they encounter something that was unforeseen. Don't forget to add the anti-harassment protections in here as well. That is very important. They go hand in hand. If workers are afraid to stop work because they're going to get yelled at, guess what? They're probably not going to stop work. Yeah, I mentioned communications, right? So I several times already. So let's go ahead and talk about it as a strategic part of your safety management system. You need to have a communication process established. That is, when and how often does the company disseminate information? What will you communicate? What channels of communication will you use? You need to take into account diversity when communicating. Things like language barriers, literacy in general, cultural issues, even disabilities, as is the case with the spoken word and the hearing impaired, or written communications and visually impaired. So really, you have to create an arsenal of comms channels that you will use, you will deploy in many different ways continuously. There's internal communication as well as external, right? How does the organization handle these? Something else you should consider. I mentioned documentation as well. ISO calls this out. Another one they call out is documentation. So in general, the organization needs to keep all documentation required by not just OSHA or EPA or employment laws and regs and local state stuff, but also those required by the safety management system. In this case, ISO 45001. Some structural things that ISO requires are as follows. 1, documents need to contain a title, a description, a date, author, or reference number. 2, they need to follow a common format like language, software version, etc., and as well as media like paper, electronic, etc. So if you have some paper stuff over here, everything else is electronic. According to ISO, they have to follow a common format. So you'll have to move everything over to digital. And you know me, getting off paper is the way to go anyway. Just consider that. ISO does say on number 2 here that they have to follow a common format and media. Number 3, establish a review and approval process for suitability, adequacy, for any changes that are made, things like that. So there has to be like an approval process. You can't just have anybody drop a procedure or a policy in the digital folder. It has to go through an approval process. So controls have to be in place for safety management system documents, right? Are they available for use when needed and by those needing them? Are they protected from being altered, or are sensitive documents protected from unauthorized dissemination? So establish a written policy spelling out the process around the request, access, retrieval, distribution, and use of specific documents, even the ones that would normally be considered quote-unquote public use, like safety data sheets. Describe how employees can get access to them and where they are kept. Also, describe how the organization will store, preserve, and even destroy documents, as well as handle changes going forward that may be needed related to those documents. Again, having a digital system for this makes it so much easier, but whatever you use, compare it to those things that I listed. And if you're taking mad notes, because I'm kind of trucking along here, that's okay. Don't worry. You can go to the show notes on the safetypropodcast.com for this episode, and you can see all these listed out. I've written this in blog format as well, so you can read about it. The next section ISO talks about is operation. Now, this section covers operational planning and control, eliminating hazards and reducing risks, management of change, procurement, emergency preparedness and response, all those written programs and policies and procedures that we're used to. That's what's going to be needed at this point here. Some of these are obvious, but one that I want to focus on is management of change. Look, your organization has to establish a process or a set of processes, planned, temporary, and permanent changes that will affect the safety management system that have to be managed. Right here, we're talking about new products and services, process changes, tools, equipment, workstations, new additions to buildings and structures, changes to general work environment, and even workforce changes. Another thing to consider is that change in one area may require a change in another, right? And this is why it has to be managed and documented. You have to have a process and a workflow, dare I say a template that you follow for all change, where it's almost like a question and answer type of thing. Does this change involve hazardous chemicals, the introduction of chemicals not yet on site? Does it introduce air contaminants, combustible because if you check yes to these, then we got to look at, are we permitted for this? Maybe we're getting into a change in our process that now throws us into some sort of a reportable quantity, or I don't know. But that's the whole point, is you have to manage these. And I can't tell you how many organizations I've gone into and have done walkthroughs where I'm like, well, where's your SPCC plan? Oh, wait, a what? We don't have an SPCC. Well, you have over, however many gallons of oil in these machines. He's like, well, when we first started, we only had 3 machines. I'm like, yeah, but you have 15 now. So who's doing the math on every machine we bring in here adds 100 more gallons of oil, So this section here is critical. ISO does call out MOC, management of change, specifically under the operations section, and that they will look to see if you have an MOC process in place, documented, and they're going to want to see evidence of it being followed. Okay, another section that ISO calls out, performance evaluation. Now, here you can guess we're talking about inspections, audits, analysis of results to ensure the safety management system is not only achieving its intended objectives, but also that those charged with the specific activities are fulfilling them as well. So performance evaluation of our SMS, but also personnel. So you're going to need to define what needs to be monitored and measured, the method that will be used, the criteria against, which you will be evaluated, and of course, when and how often and how to communicate the results or findings, right? What does this mean to the organization, and how does this drive what we do next, our activities, right? This means you're going to need to establish and maintain a documented audit program consisting of what you're going to audit, who's auditing, how and when, a date, time, and all that good stuff, but also capturing results or action items that arise as a result of the audit. Furthermore, top management has to review the organization's safety management system at planned intervals to make sure that it is still adequate and sustainable. All of the things safety pros will be doing, organizational leadership needs to do as well. They cannot just pass it off because they have hired professionals on staff, right? I talked about this in a previous episode, right? Assigning key elements of the safety management system to others to get them involved, both employees and leaders, man, that's a great approach. And it helps meet ISO expectations here in this case as well. And that gets us to the improvement piece, which is another section ISO talks about. The organization has to continuously look for opportunities to improve the safety management system and implement needed actions to support any of those improvements. And one of those I just talked about, it can come from a result of a self-audit where we identified we need to improve this aspect of the safety management system. And now it gets to ISO will get to looking at this piece and say, how are you continuously improving? Show me evidence of this. The first place most of us start is with corrective actions stemming from incident investigations, right? All recommended corrective actions, they have to be supported by the company. This is the easiest way to tell if the company is full of hot air, right? If you cannot even get basic preventative actions implemented as a result of an incident, without yards of red tape or waiting long periods of time, that's going to speak for itself. An auditor is going to pick up on that pretty quick. I know I always did. All right, look, so I blew through some of the requirements that ISO has. It's not complicated. It's actually not that intricate. You just have to get the ISO 45001 standard and kind of read through some of the requirements. I blew through a lot of them here, but you will have to buy that set of standards, unfortunately. It's a great benchmark. It is a safety management system. It's an approach that you can adopt and follow. I want to give you some final thoughts on this. I'm going to beat this drum. As I've mentioned before, continuous improvement is the foundational element of any SMS. In the end, it's about, this is a continuous process, right? And cannot simply be created once on paper and forgotten. It is not the traditional written safety program approach. ISO 45001 requires proper documentation, yes, but more importantly, you have to act on what is spelled out in your safety management system. And that SMS must first start with the scope and context of your unique organization. It's going to drive everything after that. The past several episodes diving into SMS and all of the things that go into it, systems thinking, continuous process improvement, root cause analysis, human organizational performance, the mindset and approaches needed to design, implement, and support safety management system components cannot be overlooked. Don't forget those. Don't jump straight into writing manuals and policies simply to satisfy a regulating body, whether it's ISO, ANSI, or anybody else. Okay? Don't forget all of the things that we covered in these last, several episodes. I'm going to continue this series. In the next episode, I'm going to do the same thing with ANSI Z10. All right? Just like this one, where I covered ISO 45001. I'm going to break down some requirements that ANSI Z10 has so that you can better understand what goes into these initiatives and whether or not you want to choose to voluntarily follow an ANSI Z10 standard, even pursue certification, whether it's ISO 45001. And then another one where I'm going to focus, of course, on VPP. It's near and dear to my heart. I operate in the U.S. That is, OSHA is the be-all and end-all of occupational safety and health for the most part in this country. So, I love the VPP. I love partnering with OSHA. I hope to represent VPP as well as VPPPA, the Voluntary Protection Program Participants Association, in a positive way in the hard work they're doing. But that's near and dear to my heart. I'm totally biased. I'm just going to be upfront with you on that one. But I will wait and save that one for last. The next episode, though, again, ANSI Z10, where we dive into that and break that down. So let me know what you think. If you've looked at the ISO 45001, if you're looking at ANSI, or if you have done or are doing VPP or thinking about it, let me know what you think. Go ahead and hit the email link that's in the show notes here, or go to thesafetypropodcast.com. look for this episode and contact me there as well. I would love to hear your feedback. And don't forget, reach out on LinkedIn. It's like I'm telling you, I'm giving you a lot of stuff to do here. But look, just get a hold of me. I'm out there. It wouldn't be too hard to find me. So I look forward to connecting with you and hearing your feedback. And until the next Safety Pro podcast episode, be safe.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Safety Pro Podcast, powered by iReportSource, the all-in-one digital safety solution. For info on how you can request a free demo on all the capabilities of iReportSource to streamline your business's safety management system, head over to thesafetypropodcast.com. We look forward to helping you manage safety on the next episode of the Safety Pro Podcast.